Good morning to those joining us in North America, a special good evening to those joining us late at night in Asia, and good afternoon to those across the Atlantic. Welcome to the Atlantic Council. I'm Damon Wilson, Executive Vice President of the Council, and I am pleased to welcome you all to our program today. Hong Kong on Edge, Countering China's National Security Law 1 year on. Today we mark a somber moment. This event coincides with the 1 year anniversary of the imposition of the National Security Law, a law which effectively gave Beijing direct control over the autonomous territory. To consider what now, we are joined today by an extraordinary group of policymakers and experts and activists, and we will examine how China has undermined Hong Kong's democracy and what the United States and its allies can do to exert pressure and impose costs on Beijing for its actions. Today's discussion on Hong Kong is even more pointed, as just last Thursday, Apple Daily, the newspaper that stood as a beacon of free speech in Hong Kong, was forced to close its doors. Since the imposition of the national security law, China has acted swiftly to erode Hong Kong's liberal traditions in violation of Beijing's treaty commitments under the Sino-British Joint Declaration. The national security law, with its lack of protections and due process, has, for all practical purposes, outlawed democratic activism, organizing, and speech. Over the last year, Beijing has cracked down on Hong Kong's democratic institutions and its pro-democracy movement. As the world enters an era of strategic competition with China and a broader global struggle between democracy and autocracy, Beijing's actions in Hong Kong should be a priority for policymakers in the United States and its partners and allies. Today's event addresses the importance of Hong Kong within the context of China's broader challenge to the rules-based system and offers recommendations for how the United States and its allies can prevent a further erosion of democracy in Hong Kong, and over time, how we can support the Hong Kong Democrats who seek to restore it. So along with today's event, we are releasing a new report co-authored by the Atlantic Council's Ash Jane and Joel Kessenbrenner, as well as Peter Mattis, that outlines policy recommendations for the United States and its allies in response to Beijing's crackdown in Hong Kong. The link to this report will be made available shortly in the chat. It's also available on atlanticcouncil.org. We are pleased to partner today, honored really, with Stand with Hong Kong, a global grassroots group of activists advocating for democracy and freedom, and in Hong Kong, some of whose members are here with us today. Thank you not only for your partnership today, but for your relentless focus and activism on behalf of the people of Hong Kong, and for many of your personal courage that you bring to this cause. We'll also be hearing shortly keynote remarks today from two extraordinary distinguished leaders from both sides of the political aisle, former US Senator Tom Daschle and Representative Mike McCaul, who is the ranking member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. Senator Daschle has long been a champion for democracy and human rights, and I know how much he personally cares about the fate of Hong Kong. We're delighted to have him with us today. We'll hear from him shortly. Representative McCaul has also been a leading voice on the challenges posed by China and the need for the United States and allies to respond effectively. So we're delighted to also be joined by Shabani Matani, the Hong Kong bureau chief of the Washington Post, who's here today to moderate the panel discussion that will follow the opening remarks. And finally, after the discussion, we will turn to an activist from Stand with Hong Kong who will give his perspective on the current situation. Given the potential risk to his personal safety, he will be speaking anonymously, even as we know his identity here at the Council. This discussion is part of the Atlantic Council's Democratic Order Initiative, which aims to strengthen cooperation among democracies on global challenges. This event is also part of a growing significant body of work on China that the Atlantic Council Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security has led over the past several months, featuring three major strategy papers. The first was the Comprehensive Allied Strategy for China, which provides a framework to strengthen our alliances, defend the rules-based order from China's assertive activities, and where possible, engage with China to keep it within the rules-based international system. Next, in late January, we published the Longer Telegram, written by an anonymous author, a former government official, and modeled after George Kennan's famous Long Telegram. This paper examines China's internal political dynamics and proposes a strategy for how to deal with China. And most recently, last month, we published the China Plan, a transatlantic blueprint for strategic competition that looks at the China challenge through a transatlantic lens. Convenings such as this are integral to the Scowcroft Center's mission of developing sustainable, nonpartisan strategies to address the most important security challenges facing the United States and the world. The center honors General Brent Scowcroft's legacy of service and embodies his ethos of nonpartisan commitment to the cause of security, support for U.S. leadership and cooperation with allies and partners, and dedication to the mentorship of the next generation of leaders. So as a reminder, today's discussion is public, it's on the record. And with that, I am so honored to turn the floor over to Senator Daschle for his remarks. Senator, thank you for being with us. Over to you.
Well, my pleasure, Damon. Good morning to you. And let me join you in thanking all of our participants and our viewers from around the world for joining us today. It's a real pleasure to be here with the Atlantic Council and Stand with Hong Kong to discuss the invaluable research that they're doing to curb the crackdown of the Chinese Communist Party and to support freedoms and democracy in Hong Kong. I've had the great pleasure of working with Stand with Hong Kong and its partner organization, Project Hong Kong, and I've been highly impressed by their professionalism and dedication. The organization is made up of volunteers who spend what little free time they have advocating for the preservation of Hong Kong. It is as personal for them as it is inspiring to me. The research being discussed today is extremely important for policymakers in both Congress and the executive branch. It will give elected leaders in the U.S. an idea of the stark realities that exist in Hong Kong. To lead the fight for Hong Kong, American leaders will need to rely on extensive research, cooperation, and a new, innovative approach to foreign policy. And we must work together to turn statements and ideas into actionable and lasting policies. That is what we hope to achieve in partnering with the Atlantic Council. The democratic crisis in Hong Kong sits at the center of the worrying rise in authoritarianism on a global level. Democracies around the world cannot sit idly by while China attacks human rights and basic freedoms in Hong Kong. The one country, two systems approach has devolved to one that benefits only the Chinese government. And the United States must push for the manifestation of an approach that does not simply mirror the authoritarian policies in Beijing. The world looks to the United States for leadership, so it must call on Congress and the White House to show the world that we stand with Hong Kongers in their desire to be free. Beijing has continued its assault on democracy through its new national security law that set off alarms within the foreign policy community just last year. And last week, the Chinese Communist Party used its draconian law to shut down Apple Daily, the last credible source of journalism in Hong Kong. Today, I'm joined by Nathan Law, a former lawmaker and activist from Hong Kong, who's seen firsthand how little Beijing cares about human rights and democracy, along with a series of other impressive panelists and policy experts. The magnitude of the erosion of Hong Kong's autonomy and liberties should be matched by a similar severity of American and international response. The bottom line is that China's brutal authoritarianism must change, and we must work together to protect our allies in the region. Again, I'm very pleased to see Stand with Hong Kong and the Atlantic Council working together on this critical project. And I'd be remiss if I didn't take a moment to acknowledge all of the extraordinary work that the Atlantic Council and its partners put into this paper. Specifically, I want to thank Hong Kong student activists Sunny Chung, Alex Chow, and Glacier Kwong for their support. And I'm delighted we will now see a group of panelists and a discussion led by Shivani Matani from the Washington Post. So once again, thank you for for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Senator Daschle, and thank you for lending your voice, your stature to this cause, this important cause. I'm really pleased now to turn to Chairman McCall, who has provided us with a video statement, which will now play.
I want to thank Project Hong Kong for asking me to join today. And I want to thank the brave people of Hong Kong who have stood up in the face of oppression to demand their democratic rights. Your courage is inspiring. Now more than ever, the United States must stand with the people of Hong Kong. The Chinese Communist Party's brutality and repression is on the rise, and nowhere is that more clear than in Hong Kong. Peaceful protesters have been brutalized in the streets. Over 100 pro-democracy figures have been arrested since the CCP's so-called national security law was first implemented last June. In a sad turn of events, the people of Hong Kong were unable to hold their annual candlelight vigil to commemorate this year's anniversary of the Tiananmen Square massacre. But brave Hong Kongers found a way to mark the occasion anyway. Unfortunately, the Chinese Communist Party's relentless oppression of Hong Kongers is far from over. Even after arresting Jimmy Lai, the founder of the pro-democracy newspaper Apple Daily, the CCP continued to harass others who worked there. Just last month, they arrested company executives and froze the company's assets, forcing the newspaper to halt production. But that wasn't good enough. Just this Sunday, Hong Kong police arrested a former journalist for Apple Daily as he was attempting to board a flight out of the city. But it's important to remember, as the CCP's crackdowns worsen, the people of Hong Kong remain strong and resilient, and the CCP has paid a significant cost for its repression in Hong Kong. So the world is uniting in our outrage against the CCP's aggression. This conference is just one example of that. I am here today to send a clear message to the people of Hong Kong and to the Communist Chinese Party and to the world that the United States of America stands with Hong Kong and will continue to stand with Hong Kong. I was so proud when both the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act and Hong Kong Autonomy Act were signed into law last year. Since their enactment, President Trump and Biden have used the authorities from these laws to sanction many who are responsible for the brutal crackdown in Hong Kong. But more must still be done. We are all inspired by the resolve of the Hong Kong people, and we stand with you. Thank you again for having me.
It's so important to have the voices of our congressional leaders, of prominent statesmen like Senator Daschle, Representative McCall, underscoring how the American people stand with the people of Hong Kong and stand up to the Chinese Communist Party. So at this point, I'm going to turn over the floor to Shabani Matani to introduce today's panelists. It's an extraordinary group of panelists. And I have to say, Shabani, it's an honor to have you here. And for me, this is my final week at the Atlantic Council's Executive Vice President before I head later this month over to the National Endowment for Democracy as President and CEO. And there couldn't be a more fitting way to wrap my tenure here at the Atlantic Council than to turn it over to you to hear the extraordinary thinkers, activists, and innovators that you'll moderate right now. Over to you, please.
Thank you so much, Damon, and thank you so much to the Atlantic Council for having me here today. Very honored to be moderating this very important and timely panel as we come up just about a year since the imposition of the new national security law in Hong Kong. I'm going to start first by introducing our four panelists today before kicking off a discussion here. And thank you again to everyone for tuning in. A reminder that there's a Q&A box underneath your Zoom screen where you can drop any questions at any time for any of the panelists, and we will get to them right after the discussion. So to start off, we have with us here today Nathan Law, who was the youngest ever person elected to Hong Kong's Legislative Council. He was one of the leaders of the 2014 umbrella movement protests in Hong Kong, where he rose to prominence and was forced into exile away from Hong Kong. He's now a Pritzker Fellow at the Institute of Politics at the University of Chicago. We also have with us Walter Lohman, the director of the Heritage Foundation's Asia Studies Center, the think tank's oldest research center. He's published extensively on U.S. policy towards China. We have with us as well Ellen Bock, the president of the Committee for Freedom in Hong Kong. She writes about American foreign policy with a focus on the Indo-Pacific, democracy, and human rights. And lastly, we have Ash Jain from the Atlantic Council's Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security, and he's one of the authors of the new Atlantic Council report that has just been launched today, Hong Kong's Future on the Edge, Countering China's National Security Law. He also served on the policy planning staff at the State Department. So thank you all for being here. I'm going to start off first by asking Nathan to just tell us how Hong Kong has changed in the years since the national security law has been implemented. So much has happened, and Nathan has seen himself, his colleagues, his friends be at the forefront of this. And Nathan, maybe you can share your thoughts on this.
Thank you so much for your question, Shabani. So definitely the national security law has reshaped Hong Kong's political landscape and moves it to a more authoritarian police state. And for now, the one country, two system moves much more closer to one country, one system, which the idea of division of power becomes a centralization of power, and Chinese Communist Party is transplanting the way they govern mainland China into Hong Kong. Over the past year, there have been more than 100 cases of national security law arrests, and some of them, they were just chanting slogans on the street, holding signs with protest slogans. These are, their rights of freedom of expression, and these are all compromised. And for another landmark case, there have been more than 40 democratic campaigners being arrested just because they participated in a primary election in their own camp, which they wanted to have a majority in the legislature. And the government says that it constitutes a subversive action. So such an ordinary political actions from other countries, other democratic countries, could be seen as a subversive action in Hong Kong under the very vaguely defined national security law. And we all could see the weaponized, legalized structure of this law and the right terror and political persecution it brings to Hong Kong. More than just affecting protesters or political activists, it also affects journalists, which journalists from Apple Daily, there are some of them being arrested under that crime. And also the civil society as a whole face a lot of crackdowns. You can see teachers and other professions, when they are vocal about the government, critical about the government, they are being turned to the national security law agency, and they will lose their job because of that. National education, being patriotic not only to China but also to the Chinese Communist Party, is introduced into the school and makes our civil society much unlike the way we used to see, which fused with respect for diversity, with respect for different opinions. So for now, the Hong Kong now is so strange that many of us cannot recognize. It's just filled with a weight of authoritarian governance, and the one country, two system is definitely not existing. It has turned to one country, one system, which makes Hong Kong just an ordinary Chinese city.
If I could just turn to Ash from the Atlantic Council here to talk a little bit about the new report that the Atlantic Council has just launched today. If just to pick up on what Nathan said, if Hong Kong is indeed one country, one systems, and in violation of an international treaty that was, of course, signed at the time of the handover, what is the right policy response? What should and can Western governments do, and what should the U.S. be doing?
Well, thanks, Shabani. It's great to be here. Well, as Nathan pointed out, the situation in Hong Kong is dire. This notion of one country, two systems, where people in Hong Kong could live in relative freedom, even under Chinese authority, has been thrown out the window. So what I want to do is just really articulate why it is that the United States and the free world should care about Hong Kong. What is really at stake for the U.S. and its allies? Well, first, as Damon pointed out in his opening remarks, the world is entering an era of strategic competition with China. The US and its allies have a strong interest in protecting Hong Kong's democracy as part of its broader strategy to defend the rules-based system from Beijing. Relatedly, the US has an interest in supporting democratic rights and freedoms around the world and in supporting international law, which has been undermined by China's violation of the Sino-British Joint Declaration. The US and its allies have significant economic interests in Hong Kong, and the fate of Hong Kong is linked to Taiwan, which of course the US and its allies have had a long-standing interest in defending, and emboldened China could be tempted to act more assertively in Taiwan. So to your question, what can be done to change the situation or to affect it in a positive way? Since the imposition of the national security law, there have been a number of policy actions taken, both by the Biden administration, previously the Trump administration, allies and partners. This includes condemnation, sanctions, the suspension of extradition treaties. These impacts have had limited impact. These measures, I should say. And as we point out in a report that we're launching today, there is much more that can be done and should be done for the US and its allies to take action. Our report focuses on two sets of actions. Tier 1, as we call them, would amplify the current policy framework with regard to Hong Kong. These are actions that have limited or manageable risks, but the goal is to deepen pressure on China and increase the costs that it needs to pay. These actions include, for example, doing more to expose and condemn illicit Chinese behavior by naming and defining the institutions that are complicit in Hong Kong's undermining, in the undermining of Hong Kong's autonomy. Other actions include expanding democracy assistance for civil society groups, extending sanctions to punish the Chinese Communist Party and its proxies for treaty violations, and providing safe haven for Hong Kongers, in particular because it gives political space outside of Hong Kong, Hong Kongers in exile to continue to make to be active and make this struggle continue on. The other actions we identify are what we call Tier 2, which entail elevating Hong Kong as a higher priority in its relations, in Western relations with China. This means, for example, conditioning the resumption of normal relations with China on the restoration of Hong Kong's democracy, similar to the way that relations with Russia have been conditioned on its withdrawal from Crimea. Relatedly, the US and its allies could seek to link in specific ways China's access to Western markets and its adherence to treaty commitments on human rights and democracy in Hong Kong. While this linkage could result in some countermeasures by Beijing, which need to be carefully considered, this new approach should merit consideration as part of a broader strategy to address China's challenge to the rules-based system. There's a lot more I could say on this, and I hope we can get into these options in more detail. And I look forward to the Q&A to continue the discussion.
If I could just turn it over to Ellen for a minute. A lot has been mentioned and discussed here about Apple Daily and specifically, how it was closed and how it was essentially forced to shut over the last week. How do you think this fits into sort of the broader strategy of the Chinese Communist Party, not just in Hong Kong, but sort of everywhere? Why do you think, it's not just about going after activists or going after prominent, politicians, but really a sort of all of society approach?
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me. And I'm honored to be especially with the Hong Kong Democracy Movement representatives today. You asked specifically about Apple Daily, and I think people need to understand how broad the assault on Apple Daily is, how broad the implications are. It's truly a triple whammy. It combines an assault on freedom of the press, on private business, and ultimately on the rule of law itself. So going forward, the idea that Hong Kong can continue to function as an international financial center while its freedoms are being destroyed is completely wrong and needs to be very much considered. It would be misguided and short-sighted for businesses to continue operating that way. I think everyone, as Nathan has pointed out, the national security law is severe and vague and has really broad effect. I just go on to say that so far, I really welcome Ash Jain's report. I really appreciate the strategic framework that he's trying to put Hong Kong into. Hong Kong has really been treated as a kind of discrete niche issue, partly because the United States hoped that China, this China Communist Party, would value Hong Kong, its autonomy, and the role it plays in building up China's economy. That has not proved ultimately to be the case, as we're all watching. And it really is difficult to find, to look for consequences to impose. So I really welcome studying those further. Obviously, withdrawing Hong Kong's autonomous status in U.S. law was a recognition of reality. But it also reflected that approach that I just mentioned, that the United States hoped China would see it as in its interests to maintain Hong Kong's freedoms, which again are so integral to its economy. I just say that so far, the United States hasn't found the right pressure points. And one evidence of this is that the security chief and the police chief have been promoted to new posts. They are sanctioned under US laws, and we need to find more ways to target the power centers in Beijing. And we need actions across the board. I guess I'd just like to make one or two more points. One is about the United Kingdom, which has responsibility under the Joint Declaration and has not acted to impose sanctions or to really seek to enforce the Joint Declaration or to rally its friends and allies in doing so. It has at least one prominent British citizen in jail in Hong Kong, and that's Jimmy Lai. And we believe there are others, as evidenced by some reporting that the South China Morning Post did on some consular access to British citizens. And I think all the democracies need to focus on political prisoners in exactly the same way that they did vis-a-vis the Soviet Union. Every interaction by an American official should raise those cases in every single context. Essentially, the United States and its allies need to pursue democracy and human rights in Hong Kong with the same urgency and determination that China is using to try to destroy them.
I think that's a perfect moment for Walter to jump in on the question of how strategically Hong Kong is seen as part of the broader issue of China. I think that, even in talking to a lot of Hong Kongers, especially in the streets in 2019, they would say, the US won't help us until it's Taiwan that's affected. Until Taiwan is next, then only then can we see a strong U.S. response. Have you seen the attitude shift towards that? Do you see Hong Kong becoming a much more sort of front and center issue within the Biden administration, and Hong Kong is being called within this sort of allies-led foreign policy approach that President Biden is taking as well?
Yeah, well, thank you for that question, Shivani, and thanks to everyone on the call. Good to see Nathan. Appreciate the Atlantic Council having me over for this. I think the good news is that the Biden administration has basically picked up where the Trump administration found itself in the last couple of years on Hong Kong, and seems to be proceeding in the same direction, imposing sanctions and all the rest. We know the story there in the report recounts some of that recent history. I think the most important recommendation in the report, although it's general, is to elevate the issue of Hong Kong and U.S.-China relations. That means more than sanctioning individuals like we have done, and that probably is our default mechanism, the thing that we have that's going to be the most effective, however flawed it will be. But I think we need to talk to the Chinese more about it. I think it needs to be, a top line of every talking point, of every set of talking points, along with a couple other very high-profile issues, Tibet and Xinjiang, chief among them. That's part of the cost of Hong Kong becoming just another part of China, is that it has to become a part of China's list of headaches and things that the U.S. has to face. That it has to face in its consultations with the U.S. I really wrestle a lot with this this business issue. As you know from my bio, and Ellen and I've talked a lot over the years. It's very difficult to leverage business, and it's very difficult to explain to business what's in their best interest. I've always thought it was a fool's errand to try to tell the Chinese what's in their best interest, but it's similar with business. And right now, despite the impressions and some of the headlines about showdown with the U.S. and China, and the fleeing of capital out of China and all the rest. I mean, we can sometimes create a picture of things that we want to be seeing. I don't see that at all. I mean, U.S.-China trade is on a record pace this year. It's increasing. Money continues to pour into Hong Kong and into mainland China. Hong Kong's success is going to be tied to that. It's going to be tied to China's performance over the long run. So the question then is, what can we do? What can we put in the other side of the scale to change calculations there? And it's really hard. I wish I had some good answers for you, and that's why I suggest that the targeting sanctions approach is probably the best, because it at least gets at the pocketbooks of particular individuals and their family members. I would look at expanding that as much as we possibly can, and raising the cost on individuals as opposed to raising the costs, let's say, on American businesses or others from going into Hong Kong, all of whom have their own reasons for investing there, and they are all about the things that business does best, which is their operations. They don't really focus on a lot of these things except as secondary sort of conditioning type issues.
Very, very interesting point there about business and the business community. That there is a lot that has been done and has happened since 2019. But just in conversations, and even as has been pointed out in the report, I think there is some frustration, especially among Hong Kongers who are trying to leave or seek asylum or find opportunities elsewhere, that the U.S. hasn't acted strongly or fast enough to impose new lifeboat policies. If anybody wants to sort of jump in on that, why the sort of lifeboat policies and new immigration regulations specific to Hong Kong would be important and would be a huge help to the situation unfolding there now. That'd be great.
Yeah, I will briefly if you want. I think we got to be honest about the way that this debate plays into immigration politics in the United States. Ted Cruz got a lot of flack last year for standing up and being the one objection out of 535 members to Tom Malinowski's bill to offer temporary protected status for Hong Kong. And I understand that, and I actually didn't agree with a couple of points in the case he made, but he's not being disingenuous to suggest this plays into larger politics in the U.S. regarding immigration and regarding, particularly Central America and some other issues. So I don't think that's going to change. I mean, I think we need to look within the context of current immigration law to accommodate as many people as we can, say with P2 status, refugee status, and that sort of thing, to get people to the United States that really need to get out. I think big changes in immigration policy are going to be really hard fought. And, if they originate in Congress, they're always going to have objections, and the Senate only takes one, and that's what happened earlier. Again, I think for some legitimate reasons, even if those reasons that Ted Cruz gave were not associated with the immediate problem in Hong Kong.
Yeah, probably I could jump into this question, but I want to look into it from another angle. Of course, providing safe haven and safe access to people who are fleeing political persecution in Hong Kong is important. But we also have to boost up our interaction with our diaspora community from around the world. And that is exactly one of the suggestions provided from this report. It's important for us to continue to listen to Hong Kong people when they are struggling in Hong Kong to voice up because of the threat of the national security law. And when there are more and more people fleeing Hong Kong, arriving in London, in other parts of the UK, and also in the US, in Canada, the diaspora community is growing, and it's time for the governments to build more interaction with them, to listen to them, to listen to their thoughts, and give them recognition so that they could play a role in advocating a better Hong Kong and China policy. Meanwhile, I think for them, they're also insecure because we all understand how extensive China's reach could be. So it's important for us to continue to interact with the community, and the government should increase its strength, its policies on blocking infiltration from the Chinese community and blocking those United Front actors and organizations to intimidate these Hong Kongers overseas. So I think from another angle, after they have certain access to somewhere free from the threat of the national security law, there are lots of works that have to be done. And I think giving them recognition, more interaction, and protecting them from the intimidation from the Chinese Communist Party are key issues in play.
If I could just jump in, actually, we are starting to get quite a lot of questions in our question and answer here. And perhaps I could direct the first one to Nathan, actually. Perry Link is asking, what can be done about Western businesses and banks who smile and say, what crisis? Do you think it makes sense to start making, respecting human rights abuses a precondition for trade with China?
Yeah, sorry I have to run in 2 minutes, but I think this is a really good question. That is the same stance I offered when I heard about the EU and China investment pact, the CAI, when it was introduced a couple months ago. I think it's really important that we place human rights precondition when we interact with China on a national level. It is not about what China has promised, because when we look into the case of Hong Kong, they have not kept their words. Democracy, autonomy, and freedoms, these are the promises made by the Chinese government in the 80s when Hong Kong was handed back by the British government to Chinese government. And they all vanished when it comes to nowadays Hong Kong. So it's important that for China, after they have committed some enhancement on their human rights violation, this country to commit in negotiation and signing treaty, signing certain certain deals with them. So I think this is the stance where I am coming from. And for business, I think they are caught in a very difficult situation. Just don't forget when China targets business, the business are actually going against an entire country, which the power balance is not there. So I think the government, for example, the US government should get involved and to support these companies to go counter the intimidation from the Chinese government.
Thank you so much, Nathan. And thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much.
I'm going to get to another question now from Ambassador Nathan Sales. And just a reminder to our audience, you can drop in a question anytime at the Q&A function in your Zoom link. And the question is, for any of our panelists, feel free to jump in. And this also touches the report that was just released. But what additional steps should the US take to support democracy and human rights in Hong Kong? Further sanctions on Hong Kong on mainland officials, or does the US encourage Western businesses to relocate out of Hong Kong? What does success look like? How do you measure it?
Yeah, I can try to jump in on this one because we do touch on this in our report. What are the goals? Ultimately, the goal is to put pressure on China to restore Hong Kong's democratic institutions. That's going to take time. Clearly, the Chinese are not likely to be responsive anytime soon to going that far to drastically reverse course. But in the meantime, what we can do is ensure that they're paying a price for their actions, and that price is significant enough that they will be under pressure to stop taking more drastic measures and kind of freeze things in place. Part of the way to do that has to involve using economic pressure, sanctions, targeted sanctions against individuals and institutions, both as we're doing now, but amplifying that and identifying those directly involved, Chinese companies directly involved in engaging in human rights violations, whether in Hong Kong, in Xinjiang, or other places. That should all be on the table to amplify and expand, so that there is a linkage between China's treatment of its people and its ability to do business in the West. This idea of linking trade and human rights is a challenging one, obviously, because of the ways in which our economies are intermixed, the way China is integrated into the economies of many, many countries, most countries around the world. And yet we're already starting to see selective decoupling in specific areas, sensitive technologies, 5G, other areas where it's now becoming clear that there are ways to diminish or minimize trade with China when it comes to issues or areas that affect national security and sensitive technologies. We're seeing also, as I said before, with regard to the way China treats Chinese companies that are involved in human rights violations, we're seeing steps taken to limit their trade. And I think incrementally, we need to be looking more carefully at ways in which we can take steps like this to use economic instruments to enhance pressure on China, and keep in mind that linkage ultimately is what's likely to be most effective in paying and ensuring that China pays a cost for its actions.
Ellen, if you have something to add on.
Thank you. I concur with Ash's effort to identify these economic costs and impose them. There needs to be action across the board that affects not only Hong Kong, but our total approach to China to coordinate cooperation among the democracies, to help countries that are experiencing economic coercion and respond to Beijing's sharp power efforts to use the benefits of free societies to advance their own party line and undermine ours. So it really is a total approach to China's assault on liberal democratic values that needs to happen. I noted that Perry Link mentioned this linking business and human rights. And of course, this is something that came in an earlier era of US approach to China. And although the relative power of the United States and China is different now, the principle is still there. It's still the same. It needs to be implemented. And I just add also that Nathan Law's point about the long arm of China is very important. Unfortunately, we're starting from a situation where China is exerting influence in strong democracies, but also in weak places where it's able to sometimes seize and repatriate critics and things like that. So China's influence of that type, and particularly its influence in the United Nations and its agencies, needs to be identified and curbed.
Walter, do you have anything you sort of want to add on that too?
No, only to say that, sort of amplifying point I made earlier about how you get at these things practically, and singling out business. I think even singling out Chinese business, you have to be sort of clear about what exactly we're trying to do. So would limiting access to the U.S. market for certain Chinese companies help change things in Hong Kong? It would punish those companies, and that may be a good thing. That may be effective, but will it change things? So I think one of the things we need to do is be clear about what we're trying to actually accomplish. If we're looking for change, that dictates a certain raft of ideas. If we're looking to punish China over this, it's a different set of issues. Or are we just simply trying to insulate ourselves from the sort of moral outrage of it and continue to show our moral support in other ways? I think we have to decide which of those things that we're trying to do and then move from there.
If I could just get to another one of the questions from our audience, from Chris Sanford over here, asking where does Taiwan fit into the strategic position in American foreign policy? I think that there's a lot of anxiety, in the region about Taiwan and looking at what's happened in Hong Kong and the trajectory being potentially repeated in some way. But I'm curious to hear what our panelists have to say.
Yeah, I can say something briefly on that. I think it's important to distinguish between the two sets of issues there. They're vastly different situations. I don't think that Taiwan faces the same prospect that Hong Kong has just gone through, and that's important to keep the threat in perspective because confusing that is going to create the wrong policy for Taiwan. I think the big difference, obviously, being Taiwan is an independent country for all practical purposes and has no police force on site able to enforce Chinese law, and has no prospect of getting that. Even if you look at the demographic and electoral trends in Taiwan, and there's no formal legal link to Hong Kong either, which there was in the case of Hong Kong. And in some ways, we lost Hong Kong back in the 1980s when the Brits negotiated its return. The Chinese rarely give you a do-over, I think it's fair to look back on how this unfolded to make sure it doesn't happen again, but I don't think that's likely in Taiwan.
I could add something on the Taiwan issue. It's important because I think in the eyes of the Chinese government, these issues are linked. China sees Taiwan as part of its sovereign territory, just as it sees Hong Kong as part of its sovereign territory, even though the facts on the ground may be different. In the view of Chinese leadership, ultimately they think that Taiwan will be restored to under Chinese rule. And the way they're going about things in Hong Kong, the risk that it poses is if there isn't an adequate counter response by the West and by the US and its allies, China may feel emboldened to take more provocative and more aggressive steps against Taiwan, economically, putting pressure on the island, ultimately even militarily, if it feels that the West isn't prepared to back it up. So there is a linkage between how the US and its allies respond to what China is doing aggressively in Hong Kong and what it might feel that it has the space to do with regard to Taiwan, because ultimately it feels that the Chinese are looking for a way to take back the control, the authority, and sovereignty over all of the territories that it feels properly belong to China. So I think it's incumbent on the West to make sure that the Chinese understand that there is going to be a price to pay.
If I could just ask one sort of final question to each of our panelists. I'm curious to hear, in your opinion, what you think the big takeaway of this 1 year since the national security law is. I'm curious to hear what you think is like the one lesson that people should learn from the way China has imposed this law and used it and sort of treated different institutions in Hong Kong, and what you think is the most important thing for our listeners to kind of understand from this process.
Shibani, I'd say that it's a lesson that we had ample information about the nature of China as it discarded its approach to Hong Kong and decided to impose control and project its influence much more widely around the world. And the West and the United States and the United Kingdom did not respond adequately. We've watched the destruction of a free society, and that wasn't supposed to happen. And it's a great disgrace.
I agree with that. And I think ultimately it underscores the ambition that the Chinese have and what they're willing to do to fulfill that ambition. I also think it underscores their habits of calculating these sorts of things. So I think Beijing knew exactly how far it could go and how far the U.S. and others would go in response. I think it knew sort of the balance of forces in Hong Kong and how much we could really do. And then I think that points to a third thing. I hope my presence here sort of stipulates, helps me stipulate my support for people in Hong Kong. But I think we need to be realistic, and I think we need to not raise expectations too high. I mean, I worry sometimes that maybe over the course of the last 2 years, we gave the impression that we were ready to do a lot more than we could ever squeeze out of our system here, and that helped encourage people in a way that we weren't able to back up in the end. So I think it is important going forward to try to be realistic about what we can do to affect the situation, even in the best of circumstances, but what we are likely to get through the political system here in order to change things.
And I think I would just add, agree with both Ellen and Walter that Hong Kong and what happened there underscores how far China is willing to go, what its ambitions are to change the status quo, and often how quickly things can change before the machinery of kind of diplomatic and economic responses can take effect. We're still grappling with how to deal with Hong Kong, and things are changing on the ground every day while the U.S. and its allies, sort of decide what its strategic approach will be and then how to implement it. So I think the Chinese are aware of that. They move quickly with speed once they decide the direction they want to pursue, and that they're well aware that the response for any countermeasures takes a lot of time, and as we've seen in Hong Kong, tend to have limited impact unless there's a clear determination, to take more assertive actions.
Thank you so much to all of you. Those were extremely thoughtful remarks. I appreciate it. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Matthew Kroenig, the Deputy Director of the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security at the Atlantic Council, to close us off. Over to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Shabani, for moderating this important discussion. The Atlantic Council was very pleased in this project to partner with Fight for Freedom, Stand with Hong Kong, a global advocacy group. And so I'd like to share my closing remarks with one of the activists from the group who would prefer to remain anonymous given the risks involved. So please, Stand with Hong Kong. Over to you.
Thank you, Matthew. Thank you for giving me time to speak. I'm one of the many volunteers of the advocacy group Fight for Freedom, Stand with Hong Kong. We're from the diaspora Hong Kong community worldwide. Who I am does not matter, as my voice is collective. I want to thank the Atlantic Council for hosting this event, all the speakers and panelists for your participation. I want to thank all of you, our political leaders, congressional staff members, experts, and Hong Kongers for your support and for watching today. For the past 2 years, after the breakdown of our beloved city, our group, Stand with Hong Kong, has been working non-stop to keep our movement on the agenda of Washington, London, Brussels, and beyond. We've always also been searching for breakthroughs so that our fight won't be in vain. We partner with the Atlantic Council on this research because we believe our movement needs to engage with substantive, difficult policy discussions. We're pleased with the result of this project. 1 year ago, the national security law was made into reality. And for 1 year, the local government used it to completely dismantle Hong Kongers' ways of life. The voraciousness of their destructive appetite is beyond belief. Today, freedom of expression is decimated. Freedom of speech is gone. Our friends and family have to be watchful, even of the color of the shirt and mask they wear. They can no longer make their thoughts heard. Only correct comments are allowed. Last week, Hong Kongers queued up to buy the final copy of Apple Daily. The lines of people called to mind the solemnity of citizens bidding farewell to a beloved fallen national hero. For Hong Kongers, this hero is not of conquest, land, or glory. Our hero is of the truth, liberty, and of defiance. Whatever Hong Kong may be in this strategic competition, this hero, the values it embodied, is the color of the fire that burns inside each of us. And that's what's been keeping us going for the past 2 years. It is more powerful than any repression. For the history of the CCP shows that the party is a force without humanity. It has no mercy on people it considers enemy. That's why we have been clamoring for stronger measures from the US and the world. Those who know the CCP know that they will not stop with Hong Kong. The tendency for excess means that they need to achieve some absolute state of play. And our fear, not only as Hong Kongers, but also as citizens and residents of the countries in which we now live, is that when CCP feels threatened, it will use its long arm to reach beyond its shores and change us. For that's because its own survival and our common sense of humanity are in conflict. We all know after Hong Kong, Taiwan is next. We all know Australia, Canada, Scandinavia, etc. are in great apprehension already. And we all know with bafflement and alarm that Beijing and the Hong Kong government have not changed its ways despite numerous international sanctions and condemnations. The immovable ways are in deep contradiction in a world where cooperation and compromise are keys to peace and prosperity. Their stubbornness lays bare Beijing's true colors. In our view, Beijing has not changed its ways because we have not been squeezing all the necessary pressure points. We say that our response needs to be more robust. It must match the gravity of Beijing's ambition. The US has the most at stake. Together with her allies, including the UK, the United States should apply maximum pressure so that Beijing knows that there is a better path forward. That we welcome a prosperous China, but not an authoritarian China. That they can be at the head table of the world, but not as an aggressor. We must not allow China rulers to delude themselves that the current path is correct. The challenge is on us. The challenge is on you. Let's do more. Let's do it right. Let's not fail, for failure could ultimately mean the end of our own ways of life. Ladies and gentlemen, let's liberate Hong Kong, the revolution of our times. And allow me to repeat that in Cantonese. 光復香港，時代革命. Thank you very much for listening to us. Thank you for caring about Hong Kong. Thank you for defending the future of the free world.
Thank you very much, Stand With Hong Kong, for those remarks. And thank you again for partnering with us on this project. I found the report and the discussion compelling, and really two things stick out for me. First, this idea that we should think about Hong Kong not as an internal Chinese issue, but as a broader strategic issue in this new era of competition between China, the United States, and its democratic allies. And then second, that there are pragmatic tools that the United States and its allies have to try to address this challenge that would be consistent with our broader strategic approach to China. So I think those are important insights for me. But I'd like to congratulate Ash and the other authors on the report. Thank all of our distinguished panelists for joining us today for this important discussion. And thanks to all of you participants who tuned in to view the discussion today. And let's watch this important issue as it unfolds. And please keep the Atlantic Council and the Scowcroft Center in mind as we continue to do work in this area on the China challenge, on democracy versus autocracy, an issue that President Biden has called an inflection point and one of the most important cleavages in the world today. So thank you very much. And we hope to see you all again soon.